Confession time. I actually had to knit my heel twice. You see it completed now. But what happened is I got myself confused and oriented my toe incorrectly. It was not aligned with the heel. So this is the second knitting, and now it is correctly aligned. What I had to do is remove all the work from the loom, rip it back to the correct place, rehang it on the loom, and then I marked it for clarity to make sure that I would not lose track of where the the toe, actually belongs. So it's in its correct position now. In the process of rehanging, I hung it in the most convenient way, and it did not turn out to be the exact orientation as the original. So you will see my peg numbering, if you are very sharp-eyed, is skewed from its original position. These are now the correct pegs for knitting the heel and toe. All of my straight down the foot rows are completed. And now we are up to row 102. And it begins with knit 35. So I'm starting around. And while I do, I'm going to tell you what we're up to. We're continuing with Tom Swindler's Rib Gusset Sock. And we are going to use another technique pioneered by Scarlett Royal, which is the double wedge. She, I think, began it for heels, but like many heel techniques, it can also be used for toes. So here we are working on around. If you recall, there are 36 stitches in the total circumference of the loom, the way we're set up. And I'm going to knit 35 of them. And this will begin our double wedge. So I'm going to knit on around almost all the way and not to this, everything except this peg, and I'll meet you then. Alright, this is stitch 35 that's been knitted, and instead of knitting 36, I'm going to wrap and turn, which is like this. Wrap, turn. You can do it either way. You can go first in front of the peg and then behind, or behind and in front. I don't think it makes much difference, but I'm going to try in front then behind. Kiss Loomers. This is where you could really mess up, but it's not necessary. Do not wrap and turn like this without regard for your pin, or you will get everything hung up in a most unpleasant way. So wrap and turn, that means we're going to go back the other direction. This is not the way that I usually describe it, but it's a common one, and Tom does use that terminology, so you'll be using his pattern and you'll need to know. And he will call it wrap and turn on peg 35 or whatever one we're wrap and turning on. Right there. That was the wrap and turn. There is no actual stitching going on at this point on that peg. Now this was a wrap and turn and then knit 16. So let's count up. I didn't knit that one, I wrapped and turned on that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. This should be my last knitted stitch. We'll knit them all over. And then I'm sure you've guessed what comes next. We will wrap and turn the next peg over. This is very, very much like the beginning of a short rowed heel, and it does involve short rows, no question about it. But there will be a difference coming up. Now we wrap and turn, and we knit 15. Now there's an easy way to make sure you end up in the right spot. because every time that we knit a row, it's going to get 1 stitch shorter. So last time, the peg on which we wrapped and turned was this one. This time, it'll be this one. So I know this is my last stitch to knit, and if we went and counted up, we would discover I had knitted 16. I'll get them knitted over. We'll do a couple more rows together, and then you will have gotten the hang of it. We're going to keep on doing this, rows getting shorter and shorter, until only 6 stitches are knitted in the middle. And up to that point, this is a very classic heel design, or toe for that matter. Okay, wrap and turn on this peg. Now what happens if you forget whether you were going in front or behind the peg with your wraps? Not a lot. It does look slightly different, and I think it's best to keep a consistent wrapping method, but I also think that very few people are going to be examining your sock toes so closely as to say, I believe you wrapped the wrong direction. It's just not that noticeable. So if you're real detail conscious and you want to go back and fix it, if you do that, do so, but I wouldn't feel duty bound. It's not something that I would go back over. Here's the peg on which I'm going to wrap and turn. And this will be a 15 knitted stitches row. Next one will be 14. FYI, I'm using my very favorite loom tool, and you can have a very favorite too. I have a video on making these. The nice thing is that you shape your own hook and choose your own handle, and we all have slightly different hands and slightly different ways of holding our hook and levering the stitches over. So it's nice to be able to choose exactly what works for you. I think the video is called a do-it-yourself loom hook from a pen and a nail. And I've seen some real pretty ones that other people have done. This will be your last stitch. Easy to tell because there's a stitch plus a wrap on here, a stitch plus a wrap on here, and that's what we're going to do on the third peg. So I will continue short rowing down to 6. You do the same. Alright, I just finished knit 6, and this is my final wrap and turn. Now keep in mind, we're still on row 102. This all counts as row 102. So keep knitting, going the other direction now. We're going to knit 6. The same 6 that I just knitted. And normally, if you were familiar with the basic short rowed heel, a style that I've used a lot, I think most people have, this is when we would begin to short row out. Short rowing in is as the rows get smaller, out is as they get larger. But something different is about to happen. I knitted 6, now I'm going to knit 2 together 6 times. Let's take a look before I do. There really aren't 2 stitches on here, but the wrap and turn wrap makes it seem as though there are. So it counts as a knit 2 together for the function of what we're doing. And we'll do that 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As you know, I think I often knit my last stitch first because it locks the rest of my wraps down. Especially when I'm on camera, that makes it easier not to drop anything. Now, we're going to knit 18. Get ourselves all the way back to the starting point. All the short rows occurred in here. We're going to make a continue around, and we'll be back where we began. And then we will begin row 103. So I think I will knit these over off camera so as to avoid a bigger crick in my neck, and see you in a minute. Row 103 began with our plain old knit 18 to get around here. Now we're going to knit 2 together 6 times. That's because we're down to the other side of the work where there are wraps being held on the pegs. Let's see if I can do a better job of that. If you have trouble, as I did, getting both loops over at once, this is entirely permissible. Sometimes it is difficult, and as long as they go over in the same step before you move on to a new row, the loom doesn't know the difference. The work doesn't either. Okay, so there is row 103, knit 18, knit 2 together 6 times. Row 103 began with our knit 18, knit 2 together. So it can be a little bit confusing when you read knit 11 until you picture what I just showed you. We know that the toe or heel involves half of the total stitches, in this case 18. So in your mind we need to knit 18. But at the beginning of the row we already will have knitted 2 together. One way of thinking of this wedge knitting process is that row 102 is the knitting of the first wedge, and it gets smaller and smaller down to these 6 pegs. Then 103 begins with a complete circle of the loom and then repeats 102, short rowing down again. The only difference really between the two composite actions is that the second wedge is going to begin with 2 loops on each of the pegs, because we left those on there when we began to knit around completely. So it reads knit 2 together 6 times, knit 11, whereas the previous row read knit 17 because there weren't 2 loops on any pegs at that point. But the net result in knitting is the same. We knit the first 17 of the 18 pegs and then begin the wrap and turn process, making shorter and shorter rows. At this point I've almost completed row 103. I've knitted my shortest row, I've wrapped and turned, and I'm ready to begin back the other direction, but it's still called 103. Knit 6, then knit 2 together 6 times, and that will get me back to here. You see the 2 loops coming over? That's true on all of these pegs. Kiss Loomers, do you see my left hand? When you're trying to knit over 2 at once, pressing down with the finger on the hand that's not holding the hook can help that go more smoothly. Or, as mentioned before, you can lift the loops over one at a time. That puts a little bit less stress on both you and the loom. So let's get these that were wrapped all knitted over. This is my wrap and turn. Time to begin row 104. There's the working yarn tail. We'll knit 18, knit on around, but that's knit 2 together 6 times, then knit 12, and that finishes the sock. Here I am. Now we're going to knit 2 together 6 times because there are 2 loops on each of the first 6 pegs. That's those. And knit 12. And except for putting 2 loops over at once, it feels like the same thing, and you can wrap it all in one pass if you desire to do so. At this point, the sock is basically finished. We do need to bind off and close the toe. Tom suggests the Kitchener bind off, which is done straight from the loom. And I've done the Kitchener bind off on Kiss Looms. But I must say, I think it's more challenging than life has to be. So I'm going to depart slightly from his instructions. We will close the toe with Kitchener stitch. The results will be the same, but I'm going to use a few waste yarn rounds and suggest that you do until you're quite expert so that it's not so aggravating as it would be. The problem with the Kitchener bind off directly from the loom is that you alternately have to sew through stitches back and forth, and you sew through each one twice with the yarn tail. No biggie, but we have an extra place to catch the working yarn. Between every pair of pegs, there's that pin, and it can be a little bit challenging to avoid it. So why not take a simpler method for our design of loom? So I've changed colors. That will make life easier. And I'm going to knit at least 8 rows of this contrasting color. Also, my new yarn is a little bit thicker than the old one. It's not essential that it be so, but it could make life a little bit easier too, just in that it will hold the stitches more open because of its thickness. I'm unraveling a swatch to do this. So those of you who detest wasting the yarn used in swatches, this is a great use for waste yarn. The yarn you use can be reused if it's still in good condition when you're done. But if not, you will have gotten 2 uses out of it already. Waste yarn rows are complete. That's the plum colored yarn. I've snipped my main yarn, leaving a good long tail. Now take a deep breath and sit down. I don't want you to faint. We're going to do the unthinkable and just pull this right off of the loom. There is no way it's going to ravel back to the main knitting. In fact, the whole purpose of the waste yarn is just to make sure we have something to secure the main knitting. Here's the sock off of the loom. You can see that the double wedge toe came out pretty much the same shape as the regular short rowed toe. And indeed we did short row, but we short rowed in twice rather than short rowing in and out. And some people find that simpler, less to keep track of mentally. It's the same number of stitches either way. And now I'm simply untangling the yarn tails from the main yarn because I'll be stitching with the main yarn, and I want these yarn tails tucked inside along with the remainder of the waste yarn. We'll take it out later. At present, it's going to function as a stitch holder for us. I've zoomed way in so that you can get a good look at this. It's important to see exactly what was done last. And I'm tugging on the working yarn tail coming through this stitch. So first thing we do is go across to the other side of the toe, the other face of the toe. One's top, one's bottom. That's bottom, this is top. And come up from the bottom of the first stitch. Now we're going to go across the work to the other face of the toe and come up from the bottom of the first stitch. That starts us off. This time, and the remainder of the times across, we're going to go down through the same stitch we came up through. If I stretch this out, you'll be able to see my yarn came up through here. It now needs to go down through the same stitch, and here's what I'm describing as a stitch. this area right here. Of course, my yellow yarn is behind the plum right here, but it's making a complete circuit. So down, then up into the next stitch, across to the other face of the toe, do the same thing. Do not rush. You've got to, if you've got to readjust so you can see where you came up and down, do it. Looked at from this side, I've got my needle where it needs to be, but the stitches seem upside down compared to the others because they literally are. So this is a stitch, this is a stitch. I'm working into a stitch. So it's down, up, through the next stitch. Coming back over here, we can see where we last came up, down, up. And we're going to work all the way across like that. It came through here. Oops, sorry about that. Here we go. Down, up. At this point, I'm going to back off a little bit because it's really hard for me to stay in the frame. This is the basics of Kitchener stitch, and that's happening whether you bind off directly from the loom or not. But there is something that happens. Some people have a problem with little bumpiness forming somewhere on the join. Let me get this tucked back in. I released it so that I could tug on it for you to see. There's a tendency for a bump to form right there, and for the stitches that we're working on to be either too tight or too loose for an optimal seam. That's just something you have to learn to adjust. In my experience, failure to snug it up enough here is responsible for that bump. And the rest of it is simply getting a feel of what is the exact amount of yarn used in a stitch in the main knitting and trying to emulate that in the Kitchener stitch. So practice is everything. Now that I'm not exaggerating what I'm doing, you can see how simple this is. If you can picture what is a stitch, you can do the down up, down into one, up into the next one in a single smooth operation because of the help of the waste yarn. Here are a couple of pitfalls. If you don't fold it right at the waste yarn, you might do the correct thing but a row back, which of course will make the seam not work properly. And it's easy if you end up with a tight stitch, which can happen even if you didn't stitch overly tightly. Sometimes while getting it off the loom, things shift around. You might overlook a tight stitch and therefore get your seam skewed. So it's a case of be careful, look twice, stitch once. Here's one where I'm running into a little trouble seeing where I worked last. So I'm pulling it around and I see this strand of yarn. That's my working yarn. So I stitched last coming up in this stitch, and now I'll go down into it and up in the next one. And across we go. I'm just about all the way across now, and it gets to be tight working in here. So you got to be careful finding the last of the stitches. I've got my yarn tail. You saw me finish tucking it in so I can get a good look. Here's where I last came up. So making sure to go down and up in the proper place, and it is tight. There we go. It's going to be similar on the other side. There's the right place. Oops, only behind the correct strands. I almost got a spare one in there. and that looks like it. Now I'm going to leave my yarn tail for a minute. We'll weave it in later. Here's one of the markers I placed myself so as not to get confused again about the heel placement. We're done with that. I mean toe placement. The heel placement already existed. Here's our waste yarn, and we can just pull it out. The very last row will be a little bit challenging. Well, that time it wasn't. And there's our neat closure. Okay, back on the right side, my seam is good, but I do need to weave in the yarn tail. And generally, we don't want knots in a sock. So I'm going to go into any stitch that's handy and nearby, and then run up a column of stitches up and down within. Even though this is yellow and they're not all yellow stitches, it really won't show much. See? Now I can snip the yarn now, or give myself extra security by going back down for a few stitches in the neighboring column. And now I can snip for certain. And here we are, Tom's Rib Gusset Sock with the little roll at the top of the ribbing, the Dutch heel created by Scarlett, the long tubular foot in a completely traditional method, the double wedge toe, also created by Scarlett for Loomers, and there it is, nice sock. About the yarn that I used, this is a cotton yarn with a lycra content. It's nice and tight now, but it will be tightened up just a little bit. Both the cotton and the lycra will be fluffed up and then drawn in by the heat and the moisture. So expect a somewhat denser fabric than this, which in my opinion is good for socks.